So yes, we are live straight from the Spirit Society of Baltimore. Welcome everyone present here and those that are watching. I cannot show because I'm not in the back. So, but I'll do it. So, okay, so we're gonna show the our audience here as well for those that are watching us um, online as well. So today we will continue the study of the book Health and Conscientiousness. In case we discuss chapter 9 of the second part, right, Kirsten? And the subject today is very interesting, right? So I'll pass the ball or the microphone for you to you so you can deliver your message for today. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Just want to make sure, Daniel, can you give me a thumbs up that you can hear me okay? Great. Good evening, everyone. Here just a second. I think we will shut off the music. And my apologies for not being there in person, but for health-related reasons, it was better to do this virtual for us. With that being said, this topic of death, is such a topic. It's taboo, even though we're in 2024. And let me make sure that my screen will be shared. Okay. Even in this year of 2024, it still feels so taboo to talk about this subject. Even for those of us who are in the healthcare field, as myself, been a nurse now for almost 15 years, give or take, and it still feels hard to talk about. It's never really hard to talk about when it's not about yourself, or it seems less hard when it's not, or as long as it doesn't pertain to you or any family members, then it seems less hard. But the moment you have to experience it, whether it is facing your own death or impending death or thinking about your own death, or thinking about the death of your children, your loved ones, your family members, then it takes on a whole new experience that seldom are we prepared for. Even as spiritists, it's a topic that we touch on, but it always seems like it's a little, whether it's because we do this ourselves psychologically or the way in which we talk about it, who knows? But it always seems like it's something abstract. It's not something that's going to happen to me today, tomorrow, or in the near future. So as long as that's it, we're okay talking about it. But the reality is that death can knock at our door at any moment. And logically, we know that. Intellectually, we know that. But unless you are not forced to look at, but unless you are making the conscious decision to think about it, to prepare for it, or you're around it, whether professionally or otherwise, you might not be contemplating about it. You might not be thinking about it. But this chapter, as Daniel had shared, this is part 2, chapter 9 of this book, Times of Health and Conscientiousness. Joanna, not only in this book alone, but in other books that she has written in her psychological series. One in particular, I believe it's called Existential Conflicts. There's a whole chapter on death from a psychological standpoint and how we, as human beings living on this earth, as immortal souls that we are, and how we avoid death like the plague, if you will, and how through the way in which, as we get older, the way in which our mind reacts to it. That's why we see a prevalence of midlife, or even sometimes what they call, which is not as well known, quarter life crisis, where we reach this point in our lives where we deep within our unconscious, we have this realization that we know, although death might be very far away, it still feels closer than, let's say, from when we were teenagers. So we go through this process of trying to rejuvenate, trying to be young, trying to cling to a lot of physical things in this world to almost reestablish our anchor here in the physical realm, rather doing the reverse, or at least acknowledging that the possibility, a real possibility of death will come at any time for any of us. We just don't know when that time will come. And in reality, in this chapter, Joanna talks about how it is, as simply as we can make her words, how it is important for us to contemplate death, not as something morbid, not as something foreign to us, but in the same way we look at birth. And we'll talk about that here today. So, one of the famous quotes that most of us are familiar with, Benjamin Franklin, one of our founding fathers, he's famous for this saying that there's only two things in life that are certain: death and taxes. And while that may be true, and the one thing that we do know is that, at least for us who are spiritists, is that death doesn't exist. Now, we use the term death because it's a way in which we're able to put into sort of a category to understand once a physical life ends and we continue on in our spiritual life. But for the purpose of this talk today, we just wanted to clarify what actual death is. And now, please take note, there is a difference. There is a difference when we talk about from a spiritualist perspective. There's a difference between death and disincarnation or disincarnating. There's a difference between physical death and disincarnation. Physical death, clinically, are usually these signs, generally speaking. You have no brain function, you're not breathing, and you have no pulse. From a clinical standpoint, from a medical standpoint, this is what death is. The one benefit to science from a purely materialistic standpoint is that the research continues and our understanding of what clinical death is, or as it's defined, is changing. Just recently, we were watching a documentary about death of the brain and the body. And whereas we used to have from a medical perspective, we used to believe that once your heart stops and it stops pumping oxygen to your brain will begin to deteriorate. The cells of your brain will die within a few minutes. And within 5 minutes, you have total brain death, and that's it. There's no coming back from that. That's what was historically always believed. But now there's new research in the last few years, give or take, maybe the last 5 years or so, to say that that's not exactly true. Now, we'll save this whole long story of the research, but just to add a little flavor and a little spice to this, that science is still understanding and still figuring out the complexities of the human body. Now, we don't share this to say, well, we can extend our lives for more, not necessarily, but just for us to have the understanding that science is still delving into the depths and understanding of our physical body. Now, from a spiritist perspective, death or discarnation is when, and I'll put it in simple terms there, so as not to confuse us. So I'll refer to us as this spirit, then I have my physical body. I'm going to put it in that context because it's just easier when explaining. There are other ways, perhaps better ways to explain it for sure, but this is the way in which we're going to explain it. So bear with us. We've already shown what clinical death is here. Discarnation is when our spirit, cell by cell, is being disconnected. And that, friends, does not happen in an instant. Now, this could be explained. This makes sense because science is now figuring out that even past 5 minutes, the brain is able to come back to life, if you will. And I'll leave it in those simple terms. There's a lot more to it. There's some advanced ways to regenerate the brain, if you will. You can't just pump oxygen back into your body to your brain because it causes some injury. Reperfusion injury is the actual medical term. So there's another way in the medical field. They use this method to recirculate blood throughout your body. I won't get into it, but we say all this to say we've come a long way in science. And science more and more is curiously finding there was this interesting research. I don't believe it was done in the US, and forgive me, I can pull the research up later and share it with the group. But they were studying the brains of pigs post-mortem. They decided that they wanted to study the about 6 to 8 hours or so. That was like the oldest, the pig head and the brain they would use. After death, they would go and take a bunch of deceased pigs and take their brains. Again, they were only dead for about 6 hours, 6, 7, 8 hours. And what they found through their research is they were able to regenerate the brain metabolically. So it wasn't that the pig was reanimated, but they were able to make the brain function to a degree, at least in a metabolic sense. We share all that to say, because a pig's brain, although you might be thinking, Kirsten, pig brain and my brain, I'm not a pig. Of course, we're not pigs. But the similarities of the brain, they do exist. So the thought, the theory, the hypothesis is that if they were able to do this with pig brains, maybe they would be able to do this with the human brain. I don't know of any studies where they have done this. You might be thinking, Kirsten, this reminds me of a book I read or a famous movie, Frankenstein, right? Let's not get too far off the course there, guys. Again, we're sharing all this to say, at least at the human level that we know of, that because the discarnation process is not immediate, although physical death right now, clinically, is the no breathing, no pulse, no brain function, we know that the spirit itself does not disconnect immediately. So there is that possibility of reanimation. Now, we're not going to get into all the ways in which that could happen, but just for us to think about a little bit that this subject is complex. Now, when we talk about the complexities of death, let us first talk a little bit about birth. Now, for those of you who have children or know someone who've had children, it's very common, at least here in the United States that I know of, I don't know about outside of the States, it's very common for women and couples to prepare a birth plan. It is super popular, and you basically write down all the things that you want, all your labor positions, when the baby's due, all these things you can see here on the screen. So you do all this preparing, and a lot of women even prepare. They have a playlist of music. They'll have their Bluetooth playing. They'll know what kind of scents and smells and oils they want in the room to make the whole experience very relaxing. So it is a whole to-do, if you will, in the preparation of birth plans for a lot of women here in the US. And it's a beautiful thing. It's exciting. It's like planning your wedding, if you will, for some people. But you're planning the birth of your child. So it's an exciting time. But we don't do that for death. At least we should say it's not as popular. There is the end of life care in the medical field. There are options that you have, basics of end of life planning, but not in the same way we do for birth. And we question, why is that? Why do we not change the narrative, change the way we approach death and the way that we look at birth as a transitionary time? That is the goal, because we read in the books like in different books within the Spiritist doctrine, heaven and hell, and other various adjunct literature, that on higher planets, they don't view death as we view death. Death on the more evolved planets is more as we might experience what we might equate to the changing of our clothes. Of course, we change our clothes every day, but it's not the frequency that I want you to think about, but the ease in which we go into our closet. We look at, what do I want to wear today? A black shirt, maybe some comfortable pants, and a pair of slippers. So you take off what you're wearing and you put on something new and you feel fresh, you feel rejuvenated. Well, it's similar in the higher planets. And we're oversimplifying it in the best way possible to make this make sense. But that is the ideal way to look at it. Something we are still yet far from. And we'll talk about why that might be. But the question still stands when it comes to death and preparing for it. Are we prepared? We prepare for the birth, and right now we are preparing for our own little one to come. We prepare the bassinet, the crib, the clothes, the diapers, or potential food, or formula, or breastfeeding, toys, and this and that, and all these things, rearranging our house, everything. But are we prepared in that same way when death comes? It's ironic that today we're giving this talk. We hadn't recalled that today was our late father's day of incarnation, or birth date, if you will, and recalling the last years of his life, and having some friends that work in hospice. It reminded me of a story I heard from a fellow nurse once before. And you hear these stories, good death preparation stories, very rarely, at least for me. It's extremely rare. It's not common. And I heard this one story of a family of an elderly mother who was getting ready to pass. And she, along with her children, prepared for it. She told her children how she wanted her living room rearranged to fit the hospital bed there, to get the most exposure to the sun, because they had a huge window and they lived on a beautiful farm with farm animals and a huge garden. So she told her hospice nurse and her family, listen, I want my hospital bed close to this really large window so I get all the sun, so I can look out the window and still be able to enjoy nature, even if I'm at a point where I'm bedridden and can't get out. So this hospice nurse is telling me this story, this beautiful story, again, super unique, about how this woman was able to plan bit by bit, wrote her own obituary, wrote out how she wanted her funeral to be, and all other logistical things as well. So much so, it seemed to have brought a great deal of comfort to her family. For one big reason, they didn't have to worry about it after she passed, and they felt good that they were following the wishes of their mother. Now, I digress. Are we prepared? Should we have a plan? Just like this woman did? And how should we plan? How do you do that? And why should we plan? If not for the sake of our loved ones, for ourselves? And is it just about the logistical things? What if I don't want to plan? What happens then if I just leave it all to chance? Well, if we leave things just to chance and don't plan, there's a famous phrase that's out there. When you don't plan, plan to fail. When you don't plan, plan to fail. Because when we just leave things up in the wind, we know in the books of Andrea Louise, in the book Action and Reaction, the different cases of spirits, that people who disincarnate and do not plan before, they do not get their life in order before they die, and they leave all of this stress for their family. There's one case in particular where this elderly man passes away. He had a great deal of land and money and all these things, and he had never wanted to plan or think about it. And he passed away, and it was a huge stress in his family because all of his children were fighting over all of his things, and they didn't know what to do with him. And it was a whole stressful situation that the mentor actually mentioned. This could have been avoided had he planned better. And that's not even taking into account the spiritual, emotional components. Getting into this chapter, Joanna tells us the following: the complete identification of the transitory nature of the physical body testifies to the highest stage of human awareness. In layman's terms, when we are able to accept, to know, to be conscientious that this corporeal body is temporary, that shows our awareness and our emotional, psychological maturity. She goes on, and comprises a high level of achievement that raises individuals from the level of the instincts to that of reason, and from reason to spiritual intuition. It speaks volumes. But she goes on to say and talk about, what about those who are not in this awareness, who are what we might call asleep? She says, unconscious humans like to think only of the immediacy of the physical body and to enjoy the apparent benefits it provides in the arena, the pleasures and highly aggressive sensations which they delight in with insatiable eagerness. This error causes them to become attached to the forms they dissipate and change, to objects they own now, but then change hands. We know this from different stories, again, in the spirits literature, of spirits that are so physically attached to matter and their materialistic items that even when they pass on to the spirit realm, they go through the discarnation process, and they wake up. They're so preoccupied with their money, with their home, with their things, that they remain drawn to their material objects, that it takes a long time for them to detach, unless there's an intervention sooner for them to move on. So this in and of itself should raise a red flag. I don't know if any of you have that app called TikTok. Not recommending anyone get it. Just saying, you might have seen this. You might have also seen it on other social media platforms. But there's just one creator. I do not know his name, but he does TikToks. He does these videos, and he raises these big green flags or red flags, and the flags are huge. So when he's telling us, he's hearing a story, or he's sharing a story, and it's a red flag, he holds this ginormous red flag and runs through this open field. So if we could do that right now and run through the field holding this big ginormous red flag, this would be the time to insert that clip of waving our red flag like, hey, let us think about this. Sometimes we do this on an unconscious level. We might be attached to things that we have, and it's not to say that we should be irresponsible and not care about or just mistreat or not take care of our things. We should take care of the things that God has granted to us. But within reason, and an easy way, or maybe a possible way to test this, is to think about that thing that you have that you love so much. How would you feel if you lost it or someone took it from you today? Whether it got burned in a fire, whether you were burglarized, or something just happened to your taking a flight, and it got lost on a flight and you can't recover it. How would you feel? And how many of you have ever watched, and here in the US, they do this a lot, after it's not funny, but it's funny in the way that a lot of newscasters cover this. When there's a natural disaster that happens, we'll see the reporters actually go into, let's say, for instance, when a tornado hits in Kansas or wherever across the US, and they'll go in and they'll show you all the live footage of all the houses destroyed and people that are distraught, the homeowners that are just like losing their minds because they just lost everything because of a tornado. And I'll never forget this one interesting interview. It's super old. I don't even know if the footage exists anymore, but they were interviewing in this particular city. This particular town was completely demolished, like leveled. Okay, leveled. And they were interviewing people that were standing in front of what used to be their homes, and they were going through, and of course, people are crying and they couldn't believe it, and it's really upsetting. But there was this one older gentleman, and he was sitting on a chair. It was a random chair that happened to, because of the storm, it plopped right in front of what used to be his home. And he was sitting there smoking his cigarette. And the newscaster goes up to him and says, "Sir, how are you feeling? And we're so sorry this has happened to you. Could you tell us a little bit about what you're going through right now?" And he's sitting there in the chair and he's like, "Yeah, I'm pretty relieved. I'm pretty happy." The newscaster's like, "Sir, I'm sorry. Are we hearing you? Did you say you're happy?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm so happy. Finally got rid of all that stuff. Now I feel free." And the newscaster, and I'm sure the tens of thousands of viewers that were watching it, much like myself and others at that time, were like, "Is this man under the influence? Did he just say he's happy?" And so the newscaster continues to interview him, and he says something to the effect of, "All those material things I had were just bogging me down anyway. They were weighing me down. Now I feel free. I can go start over somewhere." That is always that encounter, that interview has always intrigued us. And it's unique because we're not saying that, again, that we should be irresponsible with our things. But imagine being that disconnected from your material things that if they were to disappear for whatever reason, you'd be okay. Something just for us to think about and contemplate how attached, because these material things, this material body, doesn't really belong to us. They are on loan. Now, when we talk about death, when we talk about, the research that's out there, and there's plenty of it. One of the most famous researcher, she was a psychiatrist, who did like one of the most original groundbreaking research in the area of death and dying, was Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, as she was known while she was alive. She was a psychiatrist and known as a pioneer in hospice and grief studies. And it's really interesting because there are interviews you can watch, old interviews on YouTube, some of them you can find, but how she came into studying death and dying is kind of by accident in a sense. Nothing's by accident. But she began to notice and realize over the decades of working in hospice care that generally people had a process that they experienced on an emotional, psychological level when it came to death and dying. And she's most widely known for coining the 5 stages of the grieving process, otherwise known as the Kubler-Ross grief cycle or death and dying. And generally, she's been known to and known for these stages, which is denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. She found that working with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of patients over a span of, let's say, maybe 30, 40 years, however long her career was, that generally people experience these emotions. But the reality is that grief, and when we're looking and thinking about death and dying, on one hand, we might think that it's this linear experience, when in reality, it's the latter here. We go through a lot of different emotions. And I'm sure some of you who either watching this, whether in person or the recording of this or virtually, might have experienced death in some way. And death, not always of a human. Sometimes we experience these stages of grief when we lose a pet, when we lose a job, when we are transitioning out of one stage of our life into another. We experience grief. We grieve for what used to be into what is now. But this grieving process can be very different for many people. It's not linear. It's not that we all start with denial. Sometimes we start directly at the anger phase. But we show this and we mention this because as we talk about, as we talk about this subject, we would be remiss if we didn't mention this aspect, this emotional aspect. And it's normal and it's okay as you are beginning to contemplate death and think about it. You might go through some of these emotions. And in preparing, and even if you're entirely healthy right now, there's no thought in your mind that anytime soon you could go. Even when thinking about some of this, you might get a little angry or sad or a lot of other emotions. And just know this from an evolutionary standpoint, as we are spirits still in our evolution, we are still growing, that our emotions are okay, that we're not bad people, bad humans, bad spiritists to struggle to face death, whether it's impending or not. But it behooves us to contemplate about it. Joanna alerts us. She says, awareness about death with the consequent preparatory actions for the transition provides these individuals, us, with inner harmony and personal security. When we are able to take control, to live on purpose, because oftentimes you may be thinking, well, Kirsten, if I'm living my life preparing for death, then I won't live. No, it's quite the opposite. And I'll give you an example of why this is so true. There are many people that have experienced near-death experiences and come out of that and live fuller lives. Like 99% of them live fuller lives after their near-death experiences. Why would that be? Let's think about this together, okay? It's the realization that I don't die, that there is life after life, that we will be able to fully be appreciative and take advantage of all our opportunities that we have from moment to moment to live our life in the most positive, uplifting way. And this is where this inner harmony and personal security comes from. We heard this story. It was a father, a wife, husband and wife, and their 7-year-old son and their infant. were in a car crash. And the car crash is very unexpected. And immediately after the crash, the husband says, I came to, I kind of woke up. And he's like, I woke up to the sound of my 7-year-old screaming and crying. And he said, but I couldn't move. But I could see that my wife and my infant were deceased. He said, I knew that with absolute certainty. He said, and although I couldn't move, I could, hear my 7-year-old cry. He said, but then all of a sudden, I start to lose consciousness. And he said, all of a sudden, I'm in this light, and I see my wife, and she's holding her infant. And she turns to me, and he says, I have a very serious conversation with her. And in this light, I feel so good. I feel so loved. But my wife turns to me and says, you have to go back. You can't come with us. And he says, and I'm going back and forth with her in this realm that he didn't even know what it was, but he wasn't in his body, as he said. And his wife is saying, you can't come with us. You have to go back. Our son needs you. Our son needs you. Go back. And so he said at some point, he remembers waking back up in his physical body and still hearing his son cry. And then the ambulance comes and the usual we would expect happened. And he said, after that, my life and the way I viewed it was so different. He said, I'm no longer afraid of death because I know what awaits me, but also the way in which I live my life is with such purpose and intensity and love for all things. And the peace that he felt, it is that personal security that there's life after life and that harmony. Joanna goes on to say, clarity about their duties drives them to work on self-improvement. And in doing so, they discover that love is the inexhaustible fount of resources for the job. Ever expanding love frees them from enslaving, perturbing passions. Ever expanding love frees them from enslaving, perturbing passions. And the clarity about their duties. We see this with people who experience clinical death and have come back or experienced near-death experiences. They have a clarity about their life and their life purpose, that they came back for a reason. We hear this a lot if you go and read and listen to hundreds of cases. And this is what this is. We don't have to have a near-death experience to experience this clarity. But when we begin to accept the reality around death of the physical body, because we, the immortal spirit, we do not die. We do not die. But once we have this awareness, we have this sense of inner peace, of security, and we know what we must do in this life. We find purpose. And Joanna goes on to say, if you are already aware of the proximity of death, which represents transformation in your life, you can grow and soar above vicissitudes. Because we have clarity of mind. We know we can see the greater purpose. And we stop worrying about the little things that annoys us. She says, therefore, live the physical journey conscientiously, using your body for lofty purposes, for at the moment of your death, you will leave its material mass behind like a blissful butterfly, which, after histogenesis, is happily swept away by the gentle rivers of the infinite. Live on purpose. Live conscientiously, using our body wisely, responsibly, in harmony, to the best of our ability, because obviously we are not perfect. We are bound to make mistakes or missteps. Let us not focus and ruminate on every mistake that we make. Let us forgive ourselves and let us do better. Simply move on and do better. Because guilt can weigh us down. Let us acknowledge where we've gone wrong and simply move on. We're oversimplifying it, yes, we know, but ultimately that's what it is. And let us live a fuller life, knowing and understanding the realities that this life is temporary, this life is passing, this life is transitory. So the time that we have, let's really live it with our whole and full heart and soul. And as we come here soon to a closing, in the Spirit's book, and of course, the Spirit's book, if you're not familiar, is one of the 5 main books of Spiritism, along with Heaven and Hell, Genesis, the Gospel, the Medium's book, Spirit's book. And if you haven't read it or you don't have it, we highly encourage you to purchase it. Nowadays, you can download it on your Kindle or other types of apps. And I do believe there's even some audiobooks online on YouTube, some recordings of some parts of the Spirit's book. But if you're like us and you're a little old-fashioned, there's nothing like having a physical book in your hand and holding that and reading it. I digress. In question 155 of the Spirit's book, Kardec asked the spirits, how does the separation of the soul from the body occur? Once the bonds that held the soul are ruptured, it disengages itself. In the last sentence of this chapter in this book, in chapter 9, part 2, Joanna ends with this sentence. With the awareness of reality, life thrives in the body and out of it. Joanna actually shares this exact quote from the Spirit's book. And she tends to end a lot of the chapters in this part 2 as a reminder to us for many different reasons. One, because it's always good to go back to the foundation of Spiritism, the 5 books. And the Spirit's book, of course, being one of those major pillars to revisit and rejuvenate ourselves. And so I pose this question just as a sidebar. How many of us have this book, whether it's on Kindle or the other digital apps that exist out there? I can't even keep track anymore. For electronic books, how many of us have access to this? How many of us read this? And I'll tell you a story about my late grandmother, who became Spiritist very late in life. And one of the stories my mother used to recount, and maybe there are similar stories of other people doing this, but something my grandmother used to do, not sure why she used to do it, but if I had to guess, and I'll tell you what she used to do. First, she used to get the books of the codification, the gospel, the Spirit's book, and she would sleep with it in her bed, close to her. And she'd wake up feeling rejuvenated. Now, why she used to do this? Well, maybe because she wanted a deeper understanding. Maybe she just wanted to be closer to the book. She just felt that it was something so magical. But something for us to think about. How much do we value and prioritize our spiritual nourishment in our lives? And oftentimes people say, show me who your friends are, and I'll show you who you are. Well, show me what you do on a daily basis, and it could be very telling of the kind of person you are or what you prioritize, because that is what's most important to you. And this is not a stage or an opportunity for judgment, not at all. Just an opportunity for us to reflect. Now, I want you to ask yourself right now, what is on your bedside table? Do you have books there? You might have a water bottle. You might have a lamp. Or what do you have at your computer desk or a desk at home? What do you listen to during the day? What are you watching during the day? When people ask you, oh, what are you reading? Are you reading any good books lately? And that's not to say that we can't read any non-spiritist books. Please let us be educated on a variety of topics. But in our heart of hearts, how are we nourishing our spiritual selves? What are we doing to feed that aspect of ourselves? And more importantly, have I thought about death? Have I contemplated if I were to die, and it's not an if, it's more of a when, how do I want to leave things? Have I repaired relationships in my life? Am I living now as if I'd wish to be living? Am I doing the things that are important to me that if I were on the other side, I wouldn't have regrets? Something for us to think about. There's this great researcher. There are many great researchers in the realms of death and dying. Dr. Peter Fenwick. He was a graduate of Trinity College or Cambridge and senior lecturer at King's College, and he's one of the top researchers on the near-death phenomenon. And has written many books, one of which that The Art of Dying is a fantastic book. Many other books. And the Spiritist Medical Association has brought him several times to give talks. You can go on their YouTube channel and even just look on YouTube for some of his lectures and interviews on death and dying. Absolutely superb. And he had given a lecture, and we just kind of extracted some of his tips on preparing for what he's called a good death. And we wanted to share them as the takeaways for today because they align really well with some of the final thoughts that Joanna and us, we wanted to leave you with today. And is the following. Teach people, including children, not to be afraid of dying. So that can look very different for each of us. It can mean talking about death in a very light manner, light in the sense of not talking about the gloom and doom of it all, but looking at something natural, because indeed it is natural, as much as being born is. Learn what may happen when you die. Some of this, the physicality of it, just the knowing of it can bring us some comfort so we can know what to expect. Discuss death. Don't sweep it under the carpet. Many psychologists, therapists, Joanna DeAngelis, throughout the Spiritist literature, and many other books urge us to discuss death, not in a morbid way, but just in a way that, in the same way in which we talk about changing our clothes, but respecting it at the same time, that it is a shift, it is a change, it is an opportunity for us to reflect every day. And don't just be afraid of it and sweep it under the rug and, oh, I'll think about this tomorrow. As the famous country song goes, if tomorrow never comes, prepare for death. Don't just clean out your attic, but clear up your relationships. And we added in, and yourself. So that famous biblical phrase, go and make peace with your enemy while you're still on the road with him. That's the best way to do it. Fix things while you can fix them. If you can't, because that particular person may have passed on, you can still pray and make peace with yourself about that situation. But it's not just about, oh, let me clear out my attic, my extra bedrooms, or my garage. Let me get rid of all my stuff. It's not just about the physical things, although those things are important too. Having a living will, knowing and sharing with your loved ones how you wish things to go, whether it's you want a celebration of life or not, or much like the story I told earlier about the elderly woman who planned prior to her death. It's a few years before she died, but she knew she was dying. She planned what she wanted, the food that she wanted at her funeral. It's what made her have some comfort in knowing in that preparation, that her family wouldn't have to be so worried about it, because she knew and understood that although she would find peace, she would be moving on to a state of recovery, even though this particular patient was not a spiritist, but she had an inner knowing that there was life after life. So she didn't want her loved ones that were still on earth to stress. So she picked the caterer. I know it might sound morbid, but she picked the caterer, the type of food, suggested people what to wear, the music she wanted playing, the outfit she wanted to wear in her coffin, and all sorts of details. And not even because she was this materialistic person, but she truly wanted to bring some peace. And as someone who had to sit down with my own family many years ago and plan out our late father's funeral on all the details, I can tell you with great assurance that it is very difficult, even as a spiritist, to sit and go through those grueling details of having to pick all these things. And sometimes we just have to go through it. We're going to experience it. But this is why it's beneficial if we, as individuals, can also plan and speak about these things with a naturality to it, so we can be more at peace when the time comes. And we hope, friends, that this lecture, that this talk has not left you feeling uneasy necessarily, but as a reminder that there's life after life, that this life is transitory. We come here for a purpose. We have a reincarnatory plan to learn things. And when our time comes, our time comes. But let us be in this mindset where we are preparing for that. It's a temporary time away from our loved ones. We will miss them, but it's just temporary. And we can have that mindset that we will see our loved ones again. Absolutely, we will see them again. When our time comes, undoubtedly. So let us make our lives easier, those of our loved ones that stay easier, and our own evolutionary process. As it says in the Spirit's book, could I evolve faster if I wanted to? And the spirits respond, yeah, you can. And we're paraphrasing. You can if you put in the effort, but so few of us put that effort in. This is some of that effort. We can reach a greater sense of happiness, of tranquility within us, harmony, as Joanna calls it, an inner peace. So, with that, dear friends, we thank you so much for listening to this. And as always, I recommend you getting the book if you have it, Times of Health and Conscientiousness by Joanna DeAngelis. You can get a copy off Amazon. You also can get it at lealpublisher.com if you wish. But I will pass the ball over to Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten. That was excellent. As you just mentioned about this topic of death is not something easy to discuss, right? So, as you said, it's considered something like morbid, right? Is even like when I remember when I was looking the chapter, I was like, oh my goodness, really? Is death? Could be something else. But I think the way you brought this subject is very brings a type of comfort, a consolation that it is a natural, it's a process of life, right? So as you were speaking about the process of, be born in the physical body, death is the opposite for the other side. So when we die here, we are born in the spiritual side, right? And vice versa. So I guess we have a couple of comments here. I'll ask you to go through those comments and you can put here in the, let me see, let me just remove here so we can go ahead and see the comment and post here in the live stream. And as you go through that, and even there is some comment and question, right? So let me see here. First, let us acknowledge people that are here. Our dear friend Orlando Gray. I think Orlando Gray is from Virginia, right? I don't know.
Yes, West Virginia. Yeah.
Yeah, he has been here for us a couple of the talk. Also, our friend Melanie from Australia. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, Melanie.
There's,
Hey, Orlando.
there's a comment here from Sarah. Amazing talk. Loved hearing about this topic that many people consider taboo. Yeah, that's true. Okay, so let us pose the first question here from Alba Morales. Alba, hey Alba, how are you? Does Joanna mention in the book the origin of this atavic fear of death? Great question. Back to you.
Yeah, absolute great question, Alba. Yeah, so in this particular book, she does not talk about, at least not in depth, she doesn't talk about the um, atavistic origins of the fear of death. But in the book Existential Conflicts, she does. I want to say it's chapter 8 or chapter 9. I could be wrong, but it's a chapter entitled Death, and she talks about how it's related to our self-preservation somehow, and even to an extent that self, although it's important to have that instinct of self-preservation, in a way it can kind of get in the way of us progressing to an extent, because that fear can be so overwhelming that it leads us to make some not so great decisions about our lives. We'll often focus a lot on the material aspect. We'll invest in all things material, and that it can look very different for different people. I don't want to go into specifics of examples, but you can read that chapter in the book and see what she says about it. I'm always reluctant to use certain examples because we don't want people to think, oh, well, if this person does this, it means that they have a fear of death and dying. The reality is that we all have a little bit of this fear, and it's, again, natural in the sense that we have this self-preservation within us. However, this instinct within us. However, there is this necessity for us to talk about death with more of a normalcy to it. Again, you might still have some angst, some it's before you do something, even though we've been born and have died for many reincarnations, it's still like the first time every time. We still have that initial apprehension about it. So thank you for that question, Alba.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Albert. One more here, and then we're gonna open for question here at the center. I think it's a comment from Orland Gray. It says, "I think about dying literally every day. I blame nursing, but I think it is a natural human thing to do. Thank you." Yeah. What do you have to say over there in his comments, Kirsten?
First and foremost, Orlando, that's one of my friends, fellow nurse, if you will. So yeah, no, definitely working in the medical field and you are faced with it. Obviously, you tend to think about it a ton more because you're faced with it constantly. And it's just, it becomes more natural. But for those who do not work in the field and are not like faced with it face to face every day, almost, it's not something that they have to think about. So that's why it's more of a reason for us to culturally have this shift to be able to talk about it and make it so it's a topic that is not so taboo.
Thank you. So now I'll be open for questions here. Comment, please. Don't be shy. Uh, any comment, any question? Paula? Paula is here in the back. Yes, put the light.
Oh. You supervised me with this thing. Hello. The last comment reminded me of something a woman in Nepal shared with me when I was there on my first trip and looking at a carpet that had skulls around for a border. And I was like looking aghast. And she said to me, very good to think about death every day. Like it really puts things in perspective. This was a wonderful review. It would be wonderful for everyone to watch it and desensitize their fears about dying. And I liked the part in the slide about starting with young children, because that's a preference of mine. And I'm a big fan of children's books written for adults too, not just children. So, like The Fall of Freddie the Leaf is a good one to use even when you've just lost something. If you've lost a cat, The 10th Good Thing About Barney. If you've lost a dog, I'll Love You Always. And then also incorporating this subject matter, like we have this book, into God at Home, because it's not a one-time topic. And I really like the planning out of your death, because I know one person who did it, and it was so reassuring to see her two dogs come down the aisle in the church with their husband. So there's a lot of value in that. I like the idea of a death plan. Having read this chapter this afternoon, could you expand on the concept of spiritual intuition, as something different than intuition? Thanks.
Can I expand on spiritual intuition as it differs from regular intuition?
Yes, she said yes.
Hmm. I will say this in my limited capacity, that spiritual intuition, as it pertains to the topic of death, is that what we have, and what I have seen and what many in the medical field have witnessed, is that the knowing of certain individuals of their impending death. And it is a deeper spiritual knowing. It is, for lack of a better term, unworldly or beyond our capacity to understand. I don't have the words to explain it other than this spiritual intuition. And Dr. Peter Fenwick has talked about this, and other in his field have talked about this. When they refer to it as premonition, it's this knowing of the impending death, whether it's a death that's going to happen within a few hours or within a few months, give or take, whatever the number of, whatever the time frame is. And that there are some signs that tend to be associated with it. Oftentimes, some of these individuals will see loved ones that have passed. Those tend to be some that are more in the progressed phase, being closer to death. But ultimately, this spiritual intuition, this deeper knowing, this understanding of not only your own death and that it's impending, the time for it to come will be soon, but this deeper spiritual understanding that Joanna talks about in this chapter that brings this inner harmony, this inner peace. And that's what comes to mind when you ask that question, Paula. But it's definitely something that we could talk offline more about, because this chapter is quite deep and requires a ton of reflection for sure. But thank you for your question.
Any more questions? Comment? So Kirsten, Daniel here. So I guess I'll do the final questions. Leo is not here. Leo always let for the end, so I try to imitate what he used to say. So what would you say right now if someone approach you and says, Kirsten, my loved one is gonna die in a couple of days. So what message would you tell this person based on the explanation you have just gave to us and what Joanna Jones brings to us?
That is a really deep, profound, and difficult question. Difficult because we can never generalize. I mean, we could, and I could sit here and say a lot of things, but those types of questions are when a specific individual comes to you and with that question, with a statement, or whether they're just sharing with you because perhaps maybe they know that you believe in life after death or whatever the reason. Maybe they're just your friend or a coworker, what have you. I would, myself, I would immediately do an inner prayer first to ask for inspiration and guidance, because whomever this person that came to me or to us to ask this question or to share this with, there's a whole story behind their own lives there, and each person as individual needs different things. Some people simply just want reassurance that there's life after life. Some people just want validation that their feelings are normal, that it's okay to grieve. So everyone would require something different. But let's pretend here for a second. Let's pretend that this person believes in life after life, but is struggling. No. Let's say this person has no knowledge of life after life. They're just struggling with the pending death of a loved one. I would hope, again, that I would pray before opening my mouth. I would allow this person to speak their heart and try to really listen both to this person, but also to my intuition, to our spirit guides, to what this person might need in this moment. Because it's not about what I want them to know. It's not about, well, let me share spiritism with them. It is, how can I comfort this heart that has come to me? Probably, maybe their own spirit guide is unable to access them because they're depressed or they're just not in a good headspace. And this is what the higher spirituality will do. They'll look for someone that's nearby, that's like the first available, and they'll guide you to that person and hope and they pray that you will say something inspirational and uplifting to them. So that would be my hope, that I wouldn't take that opportunity to sit there and shove spiritism down their throat, but rather instead take the stance that maybe Christ would have taken, or St. Francis would have taken, or any other of these great minds, spiritual minds of the world, and seek to comfort this heart in what they're enduring, that it is indeed difficult. But if this person turned to me and made comments and said, well, I do think that I will see them again, it's just hard, then I would try to ascertain what their level of understanding would be and use that to bring comfort to them that, yes, indeed, there's life after life. You will see them again. And it's totally okay to grieve. But let us think about all the happy moments you've shared with this person. Because perhaps maybe it could also be the circumstance where this person might have already just passed, let's say hypothetically, and they're grieving the loss of their loved one, and they're just looking for comfort. So it's in the Spirit's book, they tell us that when we are engaged in charity work or simply helping others, it is our duty to investigate, and I'm paraphrasing, what that individual or individuals need the most. Because sometimes we might interject our own ego and say, oh, this is the opportunity where I can, showcase all of my knowledge. And it shouldn't be about me. It should be about, how can I humble myself? Allow me, dear God, to be an instrument and use my intuition to help and say the words that I need to say to this person. And it could be a variety of things. That's why I'm shying away from saying a generality, because I could say, well, there's life after life. Life goes on. But I actually had this recently happen to me, believe it or not. It was a friend of a friend of a friend that I had heard she had lost her mother. And I didn't know this girl. She's much younger than I am. When I heard that her mother passed, I immediately thought of my experience when my own late father passed away. And I immediately went back to the moments after his death and all the emotions I went through. So I sent her a message through Facebook. And I said, look, I don't know you. I know you through this person. And I just wanted to say that I'm praying for you. I had some knowledge about who she was and her background. I knew she was a Catholic. So I said, look, I'm praying for you. I'm just sending you love. If you ever need to talk about anything, I'm here and it's totally okay. This is a safe space. I actually got an opportunity to meet her in person recently, and she gave me a huge hug and had tears in her eyes and just said, thank you for reaching out to me. Like, it really touched me. And it wasn't some moment that we shared some, immense knowledge of life after life, but it was a moment that I often think that maybe the disciples try to also share with one another, and when spreading the message of Jesus is just comforting those around you. So, okay, sorry, I think I talked too much. I'll stop.
No, that was great. So I would say all the above. Everything you said is applicable. You just need to make that investigation to see what really the person's need, not what we wanted to uh, tell the person about what we know about, right? So I guess we are reaching the end of our meeting here in the physical plane, but we still have a little bit to go to do our final prayer. And Kirsten, since you are very well connected over there with John and Angela and the good spirits, so I would appreciate if you can lead us in our final prayer before we go to the passes here at the Spirit Society of Baltimore. So I'll put a music here. And thank you so much. Thank you everyone for participating. I hope you can go back and revisit this talk. And as Paula said, it's a good review. Kirsten brought a lot of information, examples, cases, what Spiritism talk about death, near-death experience. What else? What Joanna D'Angeli also, that's the purpose of this presentation, I think was a good reminder to all of us, even us that has been coming here every Saturday to learn about life in both planes, right? Thanks so much, and back to you.
Thank you, Daniel. So, with that, let us close our eyes. Let us be present here in this moment. Let us humble ourselves. Hold this blessing, our Lord, blessing in this moment, connecting with our spirit guide, our Lord, and slow our hearts. We ask that not only this message we heard here this evening, but many uplifting messages, spiritually uplifting and nourishing for us. May each one of us take the time out of our day to nourish our hearts and our minds, to find time to replenish, rejuvenate our spirit, to reconnect with our purpose, with our joy, reminding ourselves of what we're really created for. And dear God, spirit mentors, and our Master Jesus, we know that there are brothers and sisters in this world and in the next that suffer immensely, that are suffering now. We ask that with our united love and vibrations, that those who are lost in the darkness in either realms of life, those across this globe from different cultures, backgrounds, from those who are in positions of power, and those in everyday lives and families. Dear God, we pray that each one of us and all of them may be fortified, being reminded to connect with their mentors, with their divine purpose, with this divine creator, whatever name we may give. And dear Lord, may all those who are connected to us, who are present here or elsewhere, may they feel these loving vibrations surround us, invigorate every cell of our being to live our life with purpose and connectedness. We thank you. In Jesus' name, so be it.